Welcome you to another amazing challenge chat hosted by Soldiers Memorial through our STL History Live. My name is Marvin Alonzo Greer, and I'm the Education and Visitor Experience for Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. First off, we'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and we'd like to hopefully you all are staying nice and healthy and safe during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'd like to thank our sponsors for our Challenge Chat series, Beelman Truck Company, operating since 1906, and it's through Beelman's support that allows us to host these amazing Challenge Chat series for you all. Today's program is going to be on guerrilla warfare in Civil War Missouri. Before we introduce our author and speaker for today's program, we'd like to tell you kind of how this challenge chat will operate. Our presenter will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes with time at the end for questions and answers. If you have a question throughout the program, we invite you to go to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a box that says Q&A. By clicking that box, you can type in a question. And at the end of the program, I will ask Jim, our speaker, to answer those questions for you. If for whatever reason you have a concern or anything going on, you can always put that in the chat box and message to the panelists only, and we'll be able to get back to you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Irwin. James Irwin graduated from Missouri State University with a BA in mathematics. After service in the United States Army, he obtained an MA in history from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and a JD from the University of Missouri, Columbia Law School. Jim practiced law in St. Louis for 38 years. He is the author of 5 books from the History Press. His latest book, written with his wife and co-author Vicki Irwin, is Steamboat Disasters on the Lower Missouri River, also from the History Press. Jim is a member of the Missouri Speakers Bureau from 2019 to 2020, president of the Civil War Roundtable of St. Louis from 2018 to 2020, and vice chair of the Kirkwood, Missouri Arts Commission from 2016 till present. Jim is also a volunteer at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. We're really excited to have Jim be involved with Soldiers Memorial and helping bring our museum and memorial to life. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jim Irwin. And Jim, you were muted. There you go.
Thank you, Marvin. Are you sound on the goose? Are you sound on the goose? That's a question that was often heard in antebellum Missouri and referred to whether a person was in favor of the extension of slavery into the neighboring Kansas territory. Violence over that issue broke out in the mid-1850s, in an era that Horace Greeley dubbed Bleeding Kansas, and it was a precursor to the guerrilla war in Missouri and Kansas after the firing on Fort Sumter. And many who were border ruffians or jayhawkers squared off again in 1861 and later. There were over 1,000 military engagements of various kinds in Missouri during the Civil War, the third most of any state after Virginia and Tennessee, but most of them were between federal troops and guerrillas. Guerrilla warfare started in Missouri with attacks on railroads. The Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, which ran between those two cities across North Missouri, connecting the Mississippi River and the Missouri River, and the North Missouri Railroad, which ran from St. Louis up to what's shown on this map as Hudson in its present-day Macon, Missouri. General John Pope was the commander in North Missouri. And rather than simply send troops after the guerrillas and try to chase them down, he came up with what he thought was an innovative and more effective solution. He set up citizens committees of prominent secessionist sympathizers in each county who were to be held responsible for the attacks. First, they were to prevent attacks. If they failed to prevent the attacks, then they were to identify who the attackers were so that the authorities could catch them. And failing those two things, they were going to be held responsible for any damages that were caused to the railroads, bridges, and the cost of sending troops into the counties to chase down the guerrillas. Well, as you might imagine, this was not a very popular decree sent by General Pope, and many men tried to get out of it. Among them, William Uncle Billy Martin, who was a very prominent Missourian in central Missouri in Audrain County. He was appointed by Pope to the committee there and wanted to get off of it. And so he decided to visit General Pope along with his friend, and he asked to go along with him. Whoops. Isaac Sturgeon. It wasn't just a random person that he chose. Isaac Sturgeon, oh, okay. Isaac Sturgeon was, sorry about that. Isaac Sturgeon, get back here.
Jim, you muted yourself.
Myself, yeah. I don't know what's going on with this thing, but anyway. Isaac Sturgeon was the president of the North Missouri Railroad. He also happened to be married to General Pope's niece. They met with Pope and his headquarters in Mexico, Missouri. There, Uncle Billy made his plea, protesting ill health among other reasons. And then he pointed to his companion and said, "There's my friend, Mr. Sturgeon, and he can tell you." General Pope turned to Sturgeon. Sturgeon paused for a moment and said, "If I had a matter I wanted well attended to, Uncle Billy would be the man I would select." Pope laughed, but Uncle Billy was dumbfounded. "Is this the way you're trying to help me?" The general told Billy that the position was one that should not be sought, but could not be declined, and referred him to the local commander in Mexico, Colonel Ulysses Grant. Defeated, Uncle Billy was heard to say, as he walked out of the Pope's office, "I never imagined I'd be an office holder under Abe Lincoln." Who were the guerrillas? Well, there's the freelance guerrillas, I call them, typified here by William Quantrill. They were not under orders from the Confederate government directly or the Confederate Army. They sometimes cooperated with the Army, but frequently, most of the time, they did not. It's the most common kind of guerrilla, category of guerrilla that people think of. They are operated in bands as small as maybe a half a dozen and occasionally got together in groups of several hundred. A second group that's lesser known, regarded by Union authorities as guerrillas, not necessarily maybe today you would think of them as that, but these were recruiters. These were actual Confederate officers who were sent into Missouri in the summer of 1862 in particular to gather recruits for the conventional army. They did engage in some guerrilla tactics while they were in Missouri, ambushes, kidnapping of civilians, and so forth. And they also fought some conventional battles against Union forces too, most notably at Independence, Moore's Mill near Fulton, Missouri, and Kirksville. The third group, you wouldn't really consider guerrillas at all, but again, Union authorities did. And these were just regular Confederate cavalry units, raiders, who came into Missouri from northern Arkansas. Men such as Jeff Thompson, the Swamp Fox, General Joe Shelby, who operated in southwest Missouri and central Missouri, and John Marmaduke, who also invaded into central southwest Missouri from time to time. John Marmaduke, by the way, became the governor of Missouri in the 1880s. Given the reputation that some of the guerrillas had and developed, especially late in the war with the brutality that was shown in the guerrilla war, you might think that the guerrillas before the war were simply a criminal element who were taking advantage of the Civil War in order to carry on their activities under a more respectable, shall we say, banner. But it's not. Most of the guerrillas were, in fact, law-abiding citizens. Henry Taylor was the sheriff of Vernon County, Nevada, Missouri, before the war. Tom Livingston owned lead mines near French Point, which is near present-day Joplin. Frank and Jesse James became guerrillas. Their family owned a farm in Clay County with about a half dozen slaves and were considered in the mores of the time, I suppose, something of a middle-class family. George Todd, another prominent guerrilla, did have some kind of a possible criminal activity in his background before the war, but he was a bridge mason on the railroad primarily. Most of the guerrillas, particularly those who operated in western Missouri along the Missouri River in an area known as Little Dixie, came from wealthy slaveholding families. Why did they become guerrillas? Well, for many of the same reasons that young men at the time joined the armies. The political reasons, of course, to defend slavery, to defend their economic and social status. Many of them regarded the state as being invaded by Union German American troops, even those from Missouri, and also invaded by troops coming in from free states such as Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. Some became guerrillas out of revenge or retaliation. Sam Hildebrand, who was a prominent guerrilla in Southeast Missouri, operating basically as a lone wolf down there. His brother was killed by Union soldiers, and that impelled him to become a guerrilla. Cole Younger, maybe more famous as a criminal after the war, became a guerrilla during the war in revenge for the murder of his father by Union militia in Western Missouri in 1862. And of course, many of the men joined the guerrillas for the same reason they joined the Army, for adventure. It's what a young man did when the war was on. Some, like Bill Anderson, were in fact criminals before the war. Bill Anderson was a horse thief before the war, and many of them joined for the money and the thrill of it. The tactics they engaged in were what you might expect from classical guerrilla warfare: ambushes, surprise attacks on towns, usually at dawn, such as Lawrence, Kansas, Olathe, Kansas. They also attacked towns like Warrensburg and others. If they were pursued by the Union soldiers, their preferred method of escape was not to stand and fight, but rather to disperse, disappear into the brush or the bush, and hence the name bushwhackers for the guerrillas. William Quantrill, shown here, was probably the best known guerrilla, certainly the best known one operating in Missouri. He was born in Dover Canal, Ohio. Before the Civil War, he moved to Kansas, later spent some time in Utah, may have been a school teacher in Kansas. He fought with Price's Missouri State Guard at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, and probably participated in the siege of Lexington in September of 1861. But sometime thereafter, he went back to Jackson County, Missouri, when Price's army retreated to southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. And by December of 1861, he had raised a band of guerrillas, about 6 or 8 men. And by March of 1862, he was being described in Union dispatches as the notorious Quantrill. This is Jesse James. Of course, he was not famous as a guerrilla, but more famous for his post-war exploits as a bank robber and train robber. But he did join the guerrillas in 1864. This is a photograph probably taken in July of 1864 in Platte City, Missouri, just before Jesse James' 17th birthday. I show this not so much because Jesse James was famous as a guerrilla, but to show you kind of the classic way in which guerrillas dressed. The slouch hat with the plume, the large overshirt called the guerrilla shirt with the big pockets, you keep extra ammunition or other things in there, and multiple revolvers. The guerrillas, of course, were essentially cavalry, excellent horsemen, highly mobile, heavily armed. Many of them did carry multiple revolvers, some of them as many as 6, in addition to whatever rifle or shotgun they might also have. That was their favorite weapon. The revolver was their favorite weapon for close-in ambush work because you could put out a high volume of fire in a very short period of time. The Union response to the guerrillas was initially led by Hamilton Gamble. Hamilton Gamble was the provisional governor of Missouri. He was appointed to that post in July of 1861 when the elected government of Missouri was essentially driven out of the state as secessionists. There were thousands of volunteer soldiers in Missouri who were being held back from the front to provide security for the state and to hunt down the guerrillas. Hamilton Gamble wanted to change that. He was not happy with the soldiers from the free states who he thought did not understand the state or its institutions, and he wanted a force that was controlled, or at least over which he had some control, to be dedicated to attacking the guerrillas in the state and clearing the state of them. Unfortunately for him, the state of Missouri in October of 1861 only had $21,000 in its state treasury, and they could not afford to raise such a force. So he went to Washington, D.C. He met with President Abraham Lincoln, proposed to him that a Missouri state militia be formed, financed and equipped by the federal government. Lincoln agreed, and in November of 1861, they entered into such an agreement, and the troops began to be raised in early 1862. Initially, there were about 14,000 men in the Missouri State Militia, later reduced to 10,000. That's all that Congress was willing to finance. 90% of them were cavalrymen. They were unusual for troops in federal service in that they were not supposed to be used outside the state of Missouri except in an emergency. The cavalry in the Missouri State Militia was composed mainly of farm boys from rural Missouri. They brought their own horses, provided their own saddles and so forth, which was unusual for federal cavalry. But they were paid 40 cents a day for what was called the risk of horse and equipment, $12 a month. It doesn't sound like very much, but when you consider that a private in 1861 and 1862 was being paid $13 a month, it wasn't necessarily that bad of a deal for them. The Missouri State Militia fought guerrillas, they fought the recruiters, they fought the raiders. This is a photograph of a company of the 9th Cavalry of the Missouri State Militia. It was raised in central Missouri. This photograph, however, was probably taken in 1864, probably in St. Joseph, Missouri. One of the members of the 9th Cavalry Missouri State Militia was a young man named Ludwig St. John, who enlisted from Callaway County into Company A of that regiment. He must have been a very husky young man because at the time he enlisted, he was 14 years old. In the summer of 1862, with the influx of guerrillas, Quantrill attacking in western Missouri, the recruiters coming into the Missouri of that summer of 1862, Governor Gamble, with the cooperation of Department Commander General John Schofield, created the Enrolled Missouri Militia, which is sort of like Minutemen. They were called out for limited periods. Everyone between the age of 18 and 45 who were loyal had to join. If you were disloyal, you could signify you were disloyal and not join, but it was not necessarily a good career move to do that. Around 52,000 men were nominal members of the Enrolled Missouri Militia at one time or another, but very few of those actually served actively during the war. This happens to be a photograph of St. Charles County Enrolled Missouri Militia stationed at a blockhouse on Paruke Creek in western St. Charles County, guarding the railroad, the North Missouri Railroad. You'll notice that most of them don't have any uniforms on, and the Enrolled Missouri Militia usually didn't have uniforms. Many of them didn't even have weapons. You also notice that they're wearing a white band of cloth around their hats, and that was intended to distinguish them from the guerrillas who also didn't wear uniforms. Of course, the guerrillas could figure that out and wear those around their hats as well. Well, in the summer of 1862, 1863, Quantrill, as I mentioned, became notorious. He ended up being blamed for almost any raid by guerrillas during that time that occurred in western Missouri, whether it was Quantrill's men or not. They attacked civilians, they ambushed stagecoaches, they ambushed and boarded steamboats, they ambushed army patrols, they attacked towns. Other guerrillas came in, or recruiters, Joseph Porter, John Poindexter, Upton Sinclair came into the state, all in summer-long battles. John Pope, whatever you might think of his prowess as a military commander, was very perceptive in what he saw was going on in Missouri during the Civil War. And this is the way he described the dilemma faced by ordinary rural Missourians who hoped to avoid the war. He wrote, "It was impossible for any man living in the country away from considerable towns to avoid taking up arms against somebody. A quiet, peaceable man living on his farm with his wife and children and with no decided political proclivities, one way or the other, would find his house suddenly surrounded by a party of bushwhackers who, with fierce oaths and loud threats of burning his house, demanded that his wife and daughters at once prepare a meal for the party and furnish feed for their horses, regardless of the time of day or night, or whether the victim was impoverished or not. After thoroughly satisfying themselves and their horses, they departed, with fearful threats of murder in case any of the family betrayed their presence or the road by which they left. Scarcely was this party out of sight, and the poor family had restored something like order to their household, when up rode a party of Union cavalry, and charging these poor people furiously with having just harbored a party of rebels, made the same requisition for meals for themselves and horses. The only compensation offered for the poor man thus abused was an abundant supply of new and powerful profanity." Guerrilla activity did not abate in 1863. but the federal forces available to counter it did. Grant demanded that General John Schofield, the departmental commander, send all the troops he could spare to the Western Theater for the siege of Vicksburg, and he also was demanded to send other troops to units in Arkansas to serve there. All that Schofield had left to counter the guerrillas in the summer of 1863 and throughout 1864 were the Missouri State Militia, the enrolled Missouri Militia, and a few battalions of regular cavalry that were left behind. I'd like to talk just briefly about the role of women in the guerrilla war. Guerrillas did not have a quartermaster corps or supply depots. Much of the ammunition and weapons they had may have been captured from federal soldiers. Sometimes they even captured or took their uniforms and wore the blue coats. But they also had another supply line, and that was the women who stayed behind. They secretly provided shelter, food, clothing, making guerrilla shirts, and military intelligence regarding Union troop movements. In fact, many of the guerrilla bands had a rotation of farms that they would visit, various members of families of the band, and they would go from place to place, particularly throughout central Missouri. Some women smuggled ammunition to the guerrillas. Others helped to smuggle letters to the soldiers who were serving in the Confederate Army in Mississippi and elsewhere. It was necessary that letters be smuggled because it was illegal to send, receive, or even possess such letters in Missouri. In fact, if you were caught with them, you could be imprisoned or banished from the state. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Civil War, you probably know who the man on the right is, and that's General William T. Sherman, who was known for his harsh treatment of civilians during the Civil War. You may or may not know who the man on the left is. If you're from Western Missouri, you probably do. And that's General Thomas Ewing, who also became known for his harsh treatment of civilians during the Civil War. However, there was more of a connection between these two men than just that. When Ewing was just a child, his father died, or Sherman was just a child, rather, his father died, and he was sent to live with the Ewing family. And he grew up essentially as a brother to Thomas Ewing. And in fact, he married Thomas Ewing's sister and became his brother-in-law. Before the war, the two of them practiced law together briefly in Kansas. Sherman wasn't very good at it and went on to do something else. Ewing stayed behind and was actually appointed the first Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court when that territory became a state. In 1863, Ewing was appointed commander of the District of Western Missouri and Eastern Kansas. He was aware of the role that women relatives played in supporting the guerrillas, and he decided to attack that source to try to discourage the guerrillas from operating in those areas. He sought to banish some of the women away from the state and send them either south or send them out to the east or northeast, and he arrested others for having participated in guerrilla activities such as supplying them food or clothing. Those he arrested were put in a makeshift jail in Kansas City, in a building owned by George Caleb Bingham, the prominent Missouri artist, who was briefly a soldier, was also a politician. In fact, he was the state treasurer of the provisional government of the state of Missouri during the Civil War. A few days before Quantrill's long-planned raid on Lawrence, Kansas, the building in which these women were kept collapsed. Several of them were killed. Others were severely injured, some of them permanently injured. When the guerrillas heard about it, they were incensed. They thought that the building was deliberately destroyed to injure these women. They had already drawn up death lists for the raid on Lawrence, seeking to kill, among others, Senator James Lane, the prominent abolitionist who was living there. But what happened in Kansas City, spurred them on to even further violence. And so, dawn on the morning of August 21st, 1863, William Quantrill led into Lawrence, Kansas, about 300 to 400 armed men. Initially, they came upon a camp of unarmed African-American soldiers, killed about 20 of them, went through the town, pulling men out of their houses, and altogether killed more than 150 unarmed men and boys in 4 hours. Senator Lane did escape, hid in a cornfield in his nightshirt. The Lawrence raid made Quantrill a household name and cemented his fame nationally and even internationally as the most notorious guerrilla of the war, certainly the most notorious to have acted in Missouri and Kansas. Senator Lane wanted to take Kansans into Missouri and wreak vengeance on Missourians as a retribution for what had happened in the town of Lawrence. But he was talked out of it by General Ewing, and partly because General Ewing issued what was called Order Number 11. Order Number 11 directed that all civilians leave. These are the counties from Kansas City southward along the state line. And the civilians were only given 15 days to comply with the order. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 civilians were forced to leave. To make sure that the order was being carried out, Ewing ordered federal troops, mostly Kansas cavalry, urged the people along, and some of them did even more. Among them, the so-called Redlegs. And you can see in this painting, the guy with the red leggings gave names, the nickname Red Legs to this particular. They looted, they burned homes. You can see in the background of this painting, many of them burning, to the extent that this area south of Kansas City was known as the Burnt District. Well, the issuance of the order created a political storm. Bingham went to Kansas City to beg Ewing not to carry out Order Number 11, but Ewing refused, and Bingham vowed to get revenge, saying, "If you persist in that order, I will make you infamous with pen and brush as far as I am able." And this painting is the result, one of the results of his way in which to get revenge. The original of this painting is very large, it's huge, it's practically the size of a wall. It's down at the State Historical Society in Columbia, Missouri. Another version of this painting is in the Cincinnati Art Museum. We'll get back to George Caleb Bingham and Thomas Ewing a little later. The Civil War saw the creation of the Medal of Honor to honor gallantry in combat. Over 1,500 medals of honor were awarded to soldiers in the Civil War, but only 2 were awarded to soldiers for actions against guerrillas in the Civil War, and those 2 were awarded to brothers. This is Homer, James, and George Pond from Wisconsin. Before the war, James Pond was a newspaper man, an ardent abolitionist. He even fought with John Brown for a while in Kansas. When the war began, James, George, and Homer joined up with the 3rd Wisconsin Cavalry, which was sent down into southeastern Kansas and southwest Missouri and served there throughout the war. After the attack on Lawrence, Kansas, Quantrill evaded Union soldiers for a considerable period of time. But at the beginning of October 1863, he was taking his band down towards Texas. They approached a place called Fort Blair at present-day Baxter Springs, Kansas. At the time, Fort Blair was by Lieutenant James Pond. He had with him a company of men from the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry. The 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry was probably made up, but mostly, if not exclusively, of former slaves from the state of Missouri. They were eating lunch near the fort when Quantrill's men fell upon them. They rushed to the fort, got their weapons. They were surrounded by Quantrill's men riding around the fort on their horses. It was outside the fort, just outside the walls, and you can see this is actually a reproduction of Fort Blair at present-day Fort Baxter Spring, Kansas. And this is actually what the fort was. It was only filled in on 3 sides, it only had walls on 3 sides, and there were just some logs, a little building in the middle. Just outside this fort, there was a small cannon. Pond wanted men to go out and fire the cannon at the guerrillas, but he couldn't get anyone to go. One of his shots was a lucky shot, and he actually killed a guerrilla. And then all of a sudden, they disappeared over the road to the north. Didn't know what happened. Why did they leave? Why did they not come back? Well, just so happened that at that very time, there was a column of men coming south from Fort Scott, Kansas, the escort for the district commander, General James Blunt. They saw these men riding towards them and thought at first it was Pon's men, because some of them actually were wearing blue coats. But it was too late. They realized that they were guerrillas, barely managed to escape. Quantrill took his men on down past Fort Blair and on in through Indian Territory and down into Texas for the summer, or winter rather. James Pond was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Fort Blair, Baxter Springs, Kansas on October 6, 1863. The next year, in May of 1864, George Pond, along with another man, attacked 60 guerrillas who were holding some civilians captive. Civilians named Lewis Urey, Josiah Urey, and Lewis's daughter, Barbara Urey. These guerrillas thought that Pond was the advance guard for a much larger force, and they fled. And these civilians were rescued from any further retaliation or attacks by the guerrillas. The fourth brother, Philip Pond, was in one of the regiments that pursued Jeff Davis and captured him after the fall of Richmond in 1865. 1864 saw renewed guerrilla warfare in Missouri, and it was even more brutal than before. Bloody Bill Anderson, shown here, certainly earned his name. He led a band terrorizing north and north central Missouri during the summer of that year, scalping his victims, decapitating his victims. One of them, they said, he cut off the victim's nose and ears before he actually killed them. Sterling Price led an invasion of Missouri in September of 1864 and asked the guerrillas to interfere with the logistics of the Union Army up in North Missouri. And so many of the guerrillas gathered, maybe as many as 300 or 400, outside the town of Centralia, Missouri, in central Missouri. Bill Anderson led his band, about 80 men, into the town of Centralia on September 27, 1864. He ransacked the town and then stopped a train that came into the town. He took the passengers off the train, and on the train were 23 unarmed Union soldiers. These men were stripped, all their valuables were stolen. He took one man as a hostage because he'd had a man captured he wanted to trade him in, and they murdered the rest. Anderson went back to the camp, the guerrilla camp outside of Centralia, Missouri. That afternoon, a battalion of Union soldiers came into Centralia, saw what happened, and their leader, Major A.V.E. Johnston, decided to take revenge for what had happened and led his men down to attack the guerrillas, despite being told by citizens in Centralia that there were far more down there on the campsite than had actually come into town. Well, Johnston himself and all of his men were ambushed. 123 of them out of 125 were killed. Altogether, more than 100, almost nearly 150 men were killed that day by Anderson's men. Price went on came up to the Missouri River, crossed west along the Missouri River, was defeated at the Battle of Westport in Kansas City in October of 1864, and a few days later defeated at Mine Creek in Kansas, and went on down to northern Arkansas and later into Texas himself. Bill Anderson was ambushed in October of 1864 by Union troops near Richmond, Missouri. They found some orders from General Price on his body and realized who he was, and so they took his body into the town of Richmond where it was photographed. And shown here, you can see he has the slouch hat with the plume. He's got the guerrilla shirt with very fancy decorations on it, multiple you may not be able to see, but if you look closely on this photograph, Anderson cut off his ring finger and stole the wedding ring. Well, with the defeat of Price and the killing of Bill Anderson, that basically broke the back of the guerrilla war in Missouri. And while the guerrilla war did continue in 1865, it was a much lower intensity. Talk a little bit about the political problems of the war in Missouri, in the guerrilla war. The issue of slavery split the state of Missouri just as it split the country. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 did not apply to Missouri because it was not considered a state in rebellion. And during the war, what to do about slavery split the Unionists themselves into three groups. There were those known as the Snowflakes, who wanted to keep slavery. Their slogan was the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was. The Claybanks, typified by Governor Hamilton Gamble, recognized that slavery could not be kept, but they wanted to have gradual compensated emancipation. And then there were the Charcoals, typified by Charles Drake, the man shown here on the left, the radical Republicans who wanted immediate uncompensated emancipation. The Charcoals were described by one opponent as, quote, double-dyed Republicans, the black Republicans, who were unequivocally in favor of the proclamation, emancipation, confiscation, subjugation, desolation, extermination, hell, and damnation. Drake led a delegation of 70 Missourians to confront Lincoln at the White House in September of 1863, shortly after the attack on Lawrence, demanding the replacement of General Schofield as Missouri commander and that federal troops be sent to Missouri to replace the militia. Lincoln refused their demands and wrote a kind of typical Lincolnian response to Drake, describing the slavery issue as it related to the Missourians. That's one of my favorite quotes from President Lincoln. He said there were Missourians who were for the Union with, not without slavery, those who were for it without, not with, those who were for it with or without, but prefer it with, those who are for it with or without, but prefer it without. Among these, again, is a subdivision of those who are for gradual, but not for immediate, and those who are for immediate, but not for the gradual extinction of slavery. Well, the radical Republicans prevailed in the 1864 elections and called a constitutional convention that, as its first order of business, adopted an emancipation ordinance, freeing the slaves in Missouri, January 11, 1865, some 2.5 weeks or so before Congress adopted the 13th Amendment to send to the rest of the states, this dramatized in the movie Lincoln. Martial law was lifted in Missouri in March of 1865, and as I said, the guerrilla war was much less intense and essentially petered out by May of that year. Let me just go and talk a little bit about what happened to some of the people I mentioned after the war. Thomas Ewing resumed the practice of law, went to Washington, D.C. There he was appointed to represent Samuel Mudd and 2 other Lincoln conspirators in the trial. Ewing's clients were the only ones who did not receive a death sentence. They were sentenced to life in the Dry Tortugas. In politics, he lobbied Senator Edmund Ross, who had been in his Ewing's regiment. Ross had replaced Lane, who had committed suicide in 1866. He lobbied Ross to vote against the conviction of Andrew Johnson in the impeachment trial. And some say he went beyond just lobbying him. There may have been some bribes involved, but that's another story. Ross actually was featured in the book Profiles in Courage by JFK, published about 60 years or so ago now. Mudd and the other conspirators represented by Ewing were actually pardoned by President Johnson just before he left office. Ewing ran for Congress from Ohio and later for governor. He was opposed each time by George Caleb Bingham and his family, who handed out engravings of the Order Number 11 painting and criticized Ewing in the press. Ewing then eventually moved to New York City, where he practiced law until he died in a trolley accident in 1896. William Quantrill, along with some members of his band, including Frank James, left Missouri in the fall of 1864 and carried on guerrilla activities in Kentucky and Tennessee. In June of 1865, Quantrill and his men were ambushed by Union soldiers in Kentucky. Quantrill was shot. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He lingered on for a couple of weeks, died, and was buried in Louisville. And then in maybe kind of a peculiar 19th century sort of a thing, they dug up some of his bones, which went on a tour around the country after the war. His skull actually went back home to Dover Canal, Ohio. The bones that had gone on tour were in the possession of the Kansas Historical Society, and they eventually turned them over to be buried. And these bones were buried in the Confederate cemetery in Higginsville, Missouri, and this is the headstone that you'll find there. The guerrillas, however, were offered amnesty, and most of them did return to civilian life. Many of them became solid citizens. Many of them entered politics. As I mentioned, John Marmaduke became governor in 1880. George Vest, who was Confederate senator, became United States senator after the Civil War in the 1880s. Most of the guerrillas did take the amnesty. Others did not. The James brothers, of course, did not. Jesse James was governor's office in Jefferson City, was tried for murder in central Missouri, but acquitted. He was tried for robbery of a federal payroll in Alabama and acquitted. In fact, he was never convicted of any crime. He died in 1950. As for the Pond brothers, James Pond became a lecture manager. He booked many of the prominent men and women who gave lectures in the late 19th and early 20th century around the country. These included Mark Twain, with whom he was a very good friend, Winston Churchill, Anne Eliza Young, who self-described herself as the 19th wife of Brigham Young, Henry Morton Stanley, Dr. Livingston, I presume, P.T. Barnum, that's a sucker born every minute, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Kansas, living in around the Fort Scott area, and they were representatives of the Howe sewing machine company. Homer was not awarded a Medal of Honor or any medals for that matter, but in 1865, he married Barbara Urey, whose brother had rescued from guerrillas the year before. Ludwig St. John was discharged from the 9th Cavalry of Missouri State Militia in early 1865, but he re-enlisted into the 39th Missouri Infantry, probably to get a bonus, a bounty. In any event, he was discharged in August of 1865 and falls out of the historical record until 1869, when he joined the irregular United States Army. Unfortunately, he deserted, was court-martialed, and was sentenced to jail, but then he was sprung. They let him out of jail. He was sent to rejoin his unit, which needed men going on a very important mission, and they needed men, particularly battle-tested veterans like Ludwig St. John. And he did rejoin his unit, which was Company C of the 7th United States Cavalry. And Ludwig St. John, along with 220 others, was killed on Custer Hill at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. That's not the end of the story for Ludwig St. John. Most of the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were buried in a mass grave shortly after the battle. In the 1980s, there was a large prairie fire that burned off all the vegetation at the battlefield of the Little Bighorn. And pioneering archaeological detectives, battlefield detectives, were given permission to do an archaeological dig on the battlefield. And there they discovered the remains of 44 other men during their excavations, one of whom they were able to identify as belonging to Ludwig St. John. Now this is a photograph, an unidentified girl holding a herself holding a photograph of her father. She's in mourning clothes. The saddest legacy of the war were the widows and orphans who were left behind by some 700,000 deaths. But the statistics do not adequately convey the overwhelming sadness each individual death caused. Just as some examples from the guerrilla war in Missouri, Lieutenant Louis Gravenstein surrendered to guerrillas, including Frank James, on May 19, 1863, but they shot him in the head twice and killed him. He left behind a wife, Martha, and a daughter, Lena, who was 2 years old. Sergeant Porter Davis married his wife, Ellen, on January 19, 1864. He was killed near Rocheport, Missouri in August of that year. They'd been married just over 7 months. Martin Trail had a wife and 4 daughters, Anna, age 9, Martha, age 6, Mary, age 4, Emma, age 2. He joined the 25th Missouri Infantry in May of 1863. 6 months later, his wife, Marie, died. And on September 27, 1864, Martin Trail was taken off the train at Centralia, Missouri, and was murdered along with other unarmed Union soldiers like Bloody Bill Anderson and his gang, leaving behind 4 orphans. Well, the guerrilla war was brutal internecine, neighbor against neighbor. It did leave a legacy in Missouri of mutual distrust that lasted for a number of years, and endured for many years, and unfortunately also gave rise to a ready resort to violence at times to solve social and economic problems. Guerrilla war is probably the most brutal kind of war, and Missouri was one of the major theaters for that brutality. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have at this point.
Thank you, Jim, for that awesome presentation and discussion of the guerrilla war in Missouri. I know I learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure those in attendance did as well. So our first question is, did Quantrill and Anderson ever work together as a larger force, and did they ever meet?
Yes, actually Anderson was part of Quantrill's band. They had a falling out in the winter of 1863 and 64. Quantrill didn't participate much in the guerrilla war in 1864, but he finally did. Just before the Centralia massacre, there was an attack on the Union troops in Fayette, Missouri. Quantrill was there. He urged the guerrillas not to attack. He said it would be a disaster. They said, well, you're a coward, you just go ahead and leave. Well, Quantrill did leave, they did attack, and it was a disaster. He was right. And after that, as I said, he took some men with him to Kentucky and Tennessee.
Thank you for that. And just for a reminder for those of you who may have joined a little bit later, if you do have questions, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a box that says Q&A. If you click that box, you can type questions in there, and we will read those out for Jim to answer. What did, here's another question. What did Sterling Price think of the guerrilla leaders?
Sterling Price, along with most of the regular Confederate officers and generals, they, like the Union officers, did not really approve of their tactics, but they were willing to accept what they were accomplishing for him in disrupting the logistics and carrying on disruption in the state of Missouri and elsewhere. In fact, Anderson met with Price in the town of Booneville in 1864 during that invasion, and Price, or rather Quantrill, came into town, and apparently he or some of his men had some scalps they'd taken from Union soldiers or their victims on their saddles. Price refused to meet with him until those were taken away. He did, however, provide some orders to Anderson and his men, asking them to go and attack the railroads. In fact, one of the things he wanted to attack was the bridge over Paruke Creek that was being guarded by the St. Charles County and Old Missouri militia, as you saw in that photograph.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you for asking that question. So another question is, says, I have an ancestor who moved from Wright County, Missouri to Franklin County, Missouri during the time of the Civil War. Family lore says they were burned out by Quantrill's raiders. How would you suggest trying to verify such information?
If probably the easiest way, Bruce Nichols has published a 4-volume, I believe it's 4 volumes, book on the guerrilla war in Missouri, which I would say is essentially a reference work where he has tried to gather every military report, every newspaper report of any action by or against guerrillas in the state of Missouri from essentially 1862 through 1865. And if you know the approximate date, I would start there. And he has it's heavily footnoted, so you can go find the original sources that he used if it mentions that. I have used it myself. I've had other people ask me a similar question. I've been able to answer it by going to that book and finding that Bruce Nichols, who was very, very diligent, had sussed it out.
Awesome. Yes. So family genealogy and family stories and lore are very important to helping kind of connect those genealogical dots for us. So The movie Ride with the Devil came out a number of years ago, probably over a decade ago. It kind of glorifies guerrilla warfare. What are your thoughts on the movie Ride with the Devil and how that portrays the war in Missouri and Kansas?
Well, it's based on a book by Daniel Woodrell, which is very good. It actually is probably the best movie on the guerrilla war, although it does tend to it takes up the guerrilla side. So yes, it does sort of romanticize that. Parts of it were actually filmed in Missouri, which is more than you can say for many of the of the movies about Missouri. It's a pretty good movie. Yes, it does romanticize a bit. You have to take it with a grain of salt. There really isn't a movie on the other side that I can think of. But it's not bad. It's not bad. The second half really has nothing to do with the guerrilla war. It's really the first 15 or 20 minutes, maybe an hour that covers the guerrilla war itself. And then the hero leaves Quantrill's band because he's disgusted with what happened in Lawrence.
And then final question, unless some others pop up, are you mentioned the second Kansas colored troops that fought off Quantrill's men and the guerrillas. Did African Americans play a role in the guerrilla war? And if so, in what way? I guess which sides were they on, and then how they play a role in that guerrilla warfare?
Well, the raising of African American troops in Missouri was a very sensitive political matter. In fact, the first regiment that was raised was called the 3rd Arkansas instead of a Missouri regiment. There were some conflicts between African American troops and the guerrillas in Missouri and Kansas during the war, but they were actually very few. Most of the troops were actually sent to other places: Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. The ones that readily come to mind, of course, Island Mound, October of 1862, I believe was the first Kansas Colored Infantry, fought, I guess you could call them guerrillas or raiders led by Vard Cockrell. This was actually the first conflict between African-American troops and the white Confederate troops in the Civil War. People think it's the one that's a glory in Fort Wagner, but it's not. It's the one at Island Mound. Of course, they fought at Baxter Springs. There was a smaller fight in May of 1863 in the Raider Farm near Joplin, Missouri. And there, guerrillas led by Tom Livingston attacked African-American troops. Again, I believe it was 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry, who were there on a foraging expedition. Now, for many years, people thought it was simply a massacre. They just shot them all down and that was the end of it. But recently, there's an article that appeared in Missouri Historical Review by Larry Wood, who had, based upon some archaeological excavations that have been done in that area, and it appears that actually the soldiers made a last stand, but unfortunately for them, they were not able to escape it. And then there were African-American troops who fought at the Battle of Westport. I believe they were recruited also from Kansas. I'm not sure, I don't believe any of the units that were Missouri or raised in Missouri, such as the 62nd, 67th, 65th, 68th USCT or 56th, actually fought in Missouri. They were all in other theaters.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question just came in. In the end, did guerrillas focus more on civilians or military?
I would say it's hard to it's hard to separate it out. I mean, they were I would say probably they tended to focus more on military, but when you attack towns with civilians in it, or when you go onto a steamboat and try to take the soldiers off, there were also civilians there. Of course, the most notorious is Lawrence, where most of those people who were killed, although some say many of them had been or were perhaps soldiers, many of them were civilians as well. It's difficult to say. So I've also been asked in the past frequently, how many people died in the guerrilla war in Missouri? And I can't really give an answer. I don't think anybody knows, but I've been through the Nichols book trying to figure that out. And it looks like most of the casualties that they're able to identify were actually soldiers, although there was a considerable number of civilians too. Part of the problem with that is that, you know, the estimates of casualties, particularly by the enemy, are usually, you know, unreliable. And most of the reports, or many of the reports, don't actually give a number. They say a few or several or many, and you don't know how many that actually is. But there were considerable civilian casualties. I mean, and it wasn't just guerrillas who were attacking civilians. You have to keep in mind the Union soldiers did the same thing from time to time. They thought they were Southern sympathizers. You know, the men and boys, at least if they were old enough, you know, they were at risk as well. So I guess if I had to answer the question and pick one, I would say probably mostly military, but certainly not exclusively that.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay, my internet is a little weird there.
And then final question. At the beginning, you talked about a little bit about Germans. Did the guerrillas target people of German descent and German immigrants to the
Yes.
Missouri area, as well as African Americans, two groups that that's kind of would have kind of piqued their ire?
Yes, they did target German Americans, and some of the regiments were primarily made up of German Americans. For example, the 5th Cavalry Missouri State Militia. And to say that the guerrillas hated the 5th Cavalry and the 5th Cavalry hated the guerrillas would be to understate it. They were very brutal to each other. The German soldiers, they did target them. So that's very much true. In fact, there was well, in my steamboat book, there's a chapter, a Civil War chapter about a raid on a steamboat by guerrillas, and they took some soldiers off of there, and the ones who were from the 5th Cavalry they shot, and the ones that weren't, they left them alone.
Oh wow! So we'll definitely have to pick up that book on steamboats and check that story out. So we're going to go to our last slide because I don't think we have any more questions, and we're about out of time. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today for this today's challenge chat on the guerrilla warfare in Civil War Missouri. We want to thank Jim Irwin for this amazing program, and thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who are members, we want to thank you all for being members of the Missouri Historical Society, and those of you who are members of the Soldiers Memorial Giving Circle, we want to thank you so much for your donations and being members of the Soldier Memorial Giving Circle. If you'd like to become a member, or if you would like to become a member of the Missouri Historical Society's Giving Circle, you can follow the link at mohistory.org/support. And then at the end of this program, you will notice when you click out, a brief survey will pop up in your browser. We ask that you please take that brief survey. It's only a few questions, and they'll help us plan for a better visitor experience when we are doing these programs. Again, we want to thank you all for coming out today and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good day.